Hello, very beautiful community. We're going to ground ourselves about how to talk about immigration, one of the biggest issues of the 21st century. We underappreciate how big an issue it is because it cuts to the core, as we'll see in a moment, of the legitimacy crisis that Western democracies are going through. So it's not quite an all issues issue the way the climate crisis is, because the climate crisis is connected with every other issue that matters. But it is an existential issue insofar as the fate of this issue is tied to the fate of the sustenance of Western democracy. We badly screw up on immigration. We dramatize the odds of many Western democracies by 2040 becoming what Hungary is today. So we'll have this chat in response to a few clips from Rory Stewart and Alastair Campbell debating immigration a few days ago, and the rest is politics. Now, you know that we've already spoken about Rory and Alastair when we discussed long COVID, something that on top of myalgic encephalomyelitis for 20 years, I'm dealing with now over the last half a year. And that's partly why I couldn't be with you for the last few days. It was just unfeasible to sit up without it being a pretty violent situation. But I'm doing very well, as you always know. And I think part of the reason you are with me is because of how my nervous system reacts to the world and to politics especially. And we're grateful to Rory and Alastair for watching that video on long COVID and responding. So let's get into this. What is the current debate if you look at the center, or the center left, or the center right, and indeed even the left, about immigration? The current debate is between two sides. One side says, look, we've got to appease and compromise with the populist right, who are flying often irresponsibly, right, the flag for freaking out about immigration. And we compromise with them for two reasons. Bloody hell, because we don't get elected, right? So for electoral benefit, we try to appease, pan the compromise a bit. But also because we feel that if we take a harsher stance on immigration, that'll leave less oxygen for the populist right to further radicalize. So that's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument says, no, forget about that accommodation, right? Whether to moderate the populist right or whether to get elected. What you've got to do is be responsible and make the case for whatever immigration policy makes sense at the level of economic considerations, but also at the level of human rights considerations. Don't throw out economic rationality. Don't throw out human rights decency out of the window just because you want to appease these suckers who are, gaining a lot of friction over this issue. So that's the debate. And what I want to say is that, and this is a typical thing for a philosopher to say, the problem isn't that one side is more right than the other, but that the debate is really out of date, even though it keeps happening, but it's out of date. And it's out of date because fundamentally, what the debate should be about now, right? I'm saying something a bit radical, so sit comfortably, is between, on the one hand, the sustenance of democracy, and on the other hand, a soundly human rights and economics-based immigration policy. So what I'm saying is there is a conflict between the two. There's a conflict between an economically and human rights-wise sound immigration policy and the sustenance of democracy. And if we're going to have any debate that we're going to put front and center, it should be how far is what I have just said true? And that reformulation really changes the story, because the downside, right, if you accept that we've got to let go of the current debate and move on to this one, the downside of getting this wrong isn't that you're going to lose a few elections to the populist right, isn't that you're going to have a less economics-wise rational immigration policy, isn't that you're going to have an uncivilized or indecent human rights-wise immigration policy, but is that you might lose your democracy. So that's why the stakes are higher than the old debate allows. We now have to accept that we are stuck in a moment of historical moment where there is a conflict between a decent and fairly reasonable immigration policy and keeping the democratic show on the road, keeping civic consent vaguely aligned with policy. And what I'm really saying is that the issue of immigration is at the center of a legitimacy crisis that's putting democracy in danger and creating a distance between especially centrist technocratic governments and the population of the kind that there wasn't. Right, when Alastair Campbell was in power, there wasn't that kind of distance. And this really matters because when citizens now, with this legitimacy crisis, look upon whoever it is in the UK who they hold responsible for immigration, Yvette Cooper, Rachel Reeves, Keir Starmer, they're at risk of not just thinking, well, we don't like the policy, we feel resentful of it, but they're at risk of thinking that these politicians are A, illegitimate, and B, not political opponents of theirs, but enemies. So let's watch now Rory Stewart centering the idea that we may need to get more radical on immigration.
The problem is that we may need more radical solutions. We may be in a more radical time. And it may be the kind of solutions that the departments are producing are too mild. They're too cautious. They're too much within the system. And if that's true, if it's true that you've actually got a big old problem that is very unlikely to be fixed with the kind of classic submissions that come across your desk.
And now Rory is going to say that immigration is driving populist right votes.
Firstly, it is the big issue driving votes for far-right parties in Europe, and it was the big issue in the US election. It's very striking, and you've mentioned this, how Trump basically just spoke about immigration, even when his advisors were trying to make him speak about cost of living.
And now Rory asks Alastair, how are Labour approaching the immigration issues? Let's listen.
The question is, what would their answer be to the public saying, how are you going to fix this?
The answer that Yvette Cooper was giving was this sort of step-by-step approach, the getting the personnel moved from what she called the gimmicks into actually enforcement and returns, where the numbers are going up. Far closer cooperation with European partners, which is, again, as you say, why she was in Italy, why she'd been in Germany, why she'd also been to Iraq to do an agreement on helping them keep people there rather than trying to get into Europe and then on to us. So international cooperation. And then I think a very, very tough enforcement. And that's where I do think they maybe are not shouting about it.
So there's a problem with the policy that Alastair described, which wouldn't have necessarily been there 20 years ago. So what's the problem? It's very important because I know, a lot of you watching are sort of centrists politically. So it's very important to take this seriously, because there's a risk of it sounding that what Alastair is describing is just a rational government policy formation. They're looking at what to do, going to take a set of minor or medium steps. They're going to see what needs to be fixed. Fixed is an important word. And no, what Alastair has described Labour doing, quite rightly, now feels a lot more ideological to the population. It doesn't just feel like, oh, it's going to be experts taking care of a complex issue. It feels ideological. And it feels ideological because institutions are not trusted, right? And so the idea that there is such a thing as, an objective, technocratically managerial approach taking care of an issue now feels profoundly undemocratic, because it seems like it's not reckoning with the need to consult with actual feelings people have on the doorstep, right? Number one. And then B, produce policy in a way that feels transparent enough to the population. There is a risk that the population feels now that the reason technocratic centrism is so threatening is really because it's sort of policy making behind closed doors by agents and institutions who aren't trusted like they used to be. And the feeling that gives voters is that they're going to be somehow, perhaps even in a conspiratorial way, deprioritized in that process, right? So let's ground ourselves momentarily in what we endlessly say about the crisis of trust in our democracy. So we've got the state of our information environment, social media. We've got profound modes of exclusion. We've got various unthetherings of communal bonds. We have got ideologies of psychic self-realization that get in the way of dealing with politics in terms of the value of patriotism or solidarity. And that manifests in 4 feelings, right? Least importantly, feeling of unsafety when you feel your government's incompetent. More importantly, feeling of powerlessness, that there's nothing you can do to inflect the political process. Then there is the feeling of betrayal, getting closer here to the heart of the matter, which is where you feel that some outsiders are being prioritized instead of you. And 4, there's a feeling of opacity about politics. You look at it, you look at your government, you look at your political institutions, and it's not clear that they make sense. And that's the scariest thing of all, because that makes you want to throw eggs and tomatoes and sort of blow up your political system. Now, everything I've just described, these 4 feelings, right, very naturally converge on another feeling, which is the feeling of deprioritization. The feeling that somehow we should be prioritized, but instead of us being prioritized, whatever us means, it could be all citizens, it could be the citizens that really matter in somebody's view. And instead of us being prioritized, some outsiders are being prioritized instead. So the feeling of deprioritization is at the very core of contemporary political emotion in the West, right? And that makes the immigration issue so dramatically hot. So here is Rory now saying why it may be important to take a tough line.
The question of you and me disagreeing on this, maybe not, as you say, we're not in office. I mean, my instincts is that a government should be very, very open about saying this is far too high, and we're going to significantly reduce this.
What, legal migration?
Legal migration, yeah. You can't possibly have 900,000, even 700,000 people coming in a year net. It's just far too high, because you simply don't have the infrastructure and the housing. I mean, we're going to struggle to build 100,000 houses this year, and we've got a massive housing shortage. And what that would mean, I mean, Britain is already more densely populated than India. It would be a very, very odd country you'd be creating if you were bringing that in. So
we're not more densely populated than the most densely populated parts of India.
No, I'm not more densely. No, but I can't see any problem in a government saying this is far too high and we're going to bring it down. But I agree with you that you may not want to tie yourself to too tight targets.
So let's take on Rory's spirit a little bit and be honest about what it means in practice, and maybe make a couple of philosophical remarks too about how we understand immigration in the 21st century. And the first thing to say is that as Michael Ignatieff has been saying for about a decade, and nobody knows more about human rights than Michael does, the language of human rights has broken down around immigration and around refugee and asylum policy. So that's to say, of course, you're not going to let that language go if you're a CEO of an NGO in the charity sector. But if you are speaking to the nation as a politician, you need to prioritize another language. And what Michael feels that language should be is the language of the gift, the language of generosity. In a moment of crisis of trust, it's much more corrosive to tell people, shut up, it doesn't matter how you feel, because it is abstract vernacular. It means that these people have a right to come into your home, whatever you might feel about it. No, you own your home, but you are also generous, right? You can accommodate, right? You can give space in your home to people, and it's going to make you better, right? So it's a much more dialogical language that takes much more seriously people's feelings on the doorstep. One point. Second point is really very brutal. And that's that people like you and I, who care about human rights, and I care about human rights. I gave as a 21-year-old kid, I gave a 3-hour-long lecture on human rights at one of my universities. I'm very passionate about the history of human rights discourse. There will be a human rights lecture on the Philosophy Channel at some point. And I have seen a little bit, through friends working in the NGO sector in this field, that a lot of immigration policies are a heck of a lot more brutal than most citizens realize when you actually look at what it's like. My personal disposition on immigration may well push in the very opposite direction of what I might be recommending, because I feel thrilled if a whole bunch of folks from Syria move into my street. I feel thrilled if people want to come to my country, because it's an enormous compliment to Western civilization that people are seeking out to get here. But the bottom line is, what we're dealing with is the reality where it's nigh impossible to reconcile a remotely decent human rights policy, immigration policy, human rights-wise, with civic consent. So we're in a reality where either we undermine our democracy or we get very nasty on immigration. And there isn't a solution. I'm saying we're in a historical moment where we have to acknowledge that conflict is real and not bullshit ourselves that if only we got citizens to be rational enough, then they would change their mind and we would get ourselves out of this problem. And now, before we get to the more practical politics, I'm going to make an important philosophical point that sadly can't have a big role in our political discourse. And that's that there is something about the modern world that triggers us about immigration that's hard to speak about politically. There is a myth that a lot of people buy into, that you feel at home in your home because of the, economic, political, social arrangements around you. But then something goes wrong and you have to leave the place where you are at home because you're unsafe in it, if we're talking about asylum refugees. And you have to go to a place where you're not at home. And you have to come to feel at home in that place, like people whose home it is feel there. And that's an elementary misunderstanding of modern psychology. Because in a certain sense, nobody feels at home in the modern world in their home. And that's the very thing that's triggering people so much about immigration. I've noted down a sentence, so because of brain fog, I'll just read it. Rejection of immigration by Brits is not rejection of outsiders only. It's a rejection of the truth they can't speak, that they themselves do not feel at home in their home, no matter how many people they kick out or prevent from coming in. So that's a very important thing, right? It's precisely the alienation and disenchantment of modern life. It makes you feel not at home in your home that is so triggering, for people around the idea of outsiders coming in. We would be more accommodating toward outsiders if we felt at home in our homes, as we don't. And not feeling at home in our home triggers us about the outsiders coming in. Now, one last philosophical point. In politics, you can't say that you'll ignore people, right, just because their views are pathological. You just can't do that. As long as their views are reasonable, as long as they meet a different kind of standard. That's to say, reasonable as meaning that the citizen has thought a little bit about it, that their view is just, is sustained enough. It's not just an episodic dispositional state. If they're reflected about it, you've got to take that view seriously, even if it's pathological. Obviously, the emotion of disgust is very central here when people react to outsiders. And disgust is psychoanalytically based on two things. Finding something ugly, let's substitute that for disgust, is based on two things. Fear of the unknown and fear of death, right? So, but what you can't do is tell voters on the doorstep, well, if you saw your psychoanalyst, long enough, you'd realize that your feelings are wrong about this, and then you wouldn't be committed to an irrational view on immigration. Just like you can't tell citizens on the doorstep about this business of people not being at home in their home, right? Because you could just be sent to hell by them. You know what the problem is, Mr. Smith, with your view on immigration? It's that you haven't adequately understood the sociology of modernity. What are you going to be told on the doorstep? Let's get much more pragmatic just to finish off. What do you want from politicians who are talking to the country about immigration? Well, first of all, you want a vision for the country. You want the immigration policy to be part of a positive, robust, non-defense playing, but offense playing, right? Conversation about a vision for the country. That's hard because when a crisis of trust is so extreme, the response of journalistic institutions, but also political institutions, is to play defense and sort of make only conservative moves and keep taking little steps back, and always be reactive rather than proactive, right? So that's very, very important. The second thing that's very important is that you over-communicate and that you are over-transparent about what you're planning to do and what you're thinking. And you've got to do that always in reference to a concept that's central here, which is control. You've got to control the border, right? So over-communicate, be over-transparent. And then the next thing you want is you've got to be confident. Well, it's really an implication of what I've just said, so in a way I'm repeating myself. But you've got to be confident in how you talk about this. And one of the biggest problems with the current government in the UK is that they are more individually decent than the previous government, though they're largely continuing a policy of a more responsible version of technocratic centrism. but they're not so confident, right? And one of the things that I felt actually when Rory and Alastair interviewed the future Chancellor Rachel Reeves is that I liked her more than Rory liked her, perhaps because she actually lacks social confidence. She's a very good example of, and she's sort of my age, I think a year or two older. So it's really talking about somebody who has still the possibility to develop. But at the moment, that rigidity and that woodenness there and how she communicates about key issues is simply a product of a woman who is not as socially confident as she would be if she were free enough to act more like herself. So she's actually quite a lot more likable than she comes across as. And that sort of description I've given does inspire empathy, of course, and sort of support. Come on, you can do it. But it's also, unfortunately, profoundly toxic in today's political environment on key issues like immigration to lack confidence and play defense and be wooden in this way. Enough. I think we've given ourselves a bit of a grounding. Lots and lots of love.